Good morning, everybody. My name is John Butler, for those who just come in. My background is, I've worked in medical research. I've worked mainly in experimental neuroanatomy. I've worked as a medical psychologist, teaching within various academic settings, mainly in medical schools, obviously, but I worked in academia teaching neuroscience and other subjects as well over the years. I've worked in clinical work as a therapist, specializing in clinical hypnotherapy, but I trained in various forms of psychotherapy and counseling. And it's that mixture of backgrounds that I feel is of value to me in helping to understand the dynamics of what happens within groups and individuals, in the minds of people, in their nervous system or in the brain, whether you see the mind as the brain or more than that. But we know a certain amount about what goes on, and a lot about it we don't still know. And the interesting topic that Mike presented me to talk on was the power of the mind, as it were, the abuses and uses of the mind. And the subject of the mind and its powers, potentials, has excited the imagination of people throughout history. What are the limits of the power? What is the nature of it? How can it be influenced, for good or for bad? And that's a very, very large topic, and I'm going to keep it quite simple, tackling 7 main areas and giving you an outline of the research that I know of, which is other people's work, the research I've done myself, which is a lot of it based on clinical observation, but that's backed up by clinical observation of lots of other people. I've also drawn on a number of sources looked at the counter views, so I would like to present what I feel is reasonably balanced, but mostly focusing on the abuses, in this case, that can occur when the destructive influence of individuals and groups is affecting a particular person. What is going on? What gets them into that position or makes them more likely to be influenced by that group? And what happens once they're in that environment or situation? And what can be done if they decide they want to leave? How can they be helped? And later on, what kind of steps are taken for a recovery for that person to get themselves, if you like, into a different state of mind that they were in when they were in that group. Now, that's not an easy thing to cover even in this period. The subject of destructive groups, the dynamics, the methods involved will take a lot of, I could be here talking for a week, so I'm going to, even in that area, I'm going to narrow it down and talk about some of the main points. Getting involved in groups, and we're talking here about destructive groups, and there's a range of destructiveness involved. Some groups are a little bit wacky, some are very seriously damaging, some you can lose your life to them, basically. I mean, groups that have been involved in murder of members or murder of outsiders more often. And any connection of people can be called a cult, but we're talking about a destructive cult. Groups with cultist tendencies that exert undue influence, use techniques of persuasion, directly or indirectly, to program people to do things that they may not do, and to think about things they would not normally think if they hadn't been in that group, for destructive purposes, which are destructive for the individual, but may be very beneficial for the person running the group, the leader, and maybe a bunch of people closely associated with that person, who have a particular goal to influence that nervous system of that individual to achieve what they desire. We've all got images of people joining groups, and many people out there in the public who say, well, I would never join that lot, they're weird. The very same person will be influenced by the advertising on television. They'll be influenced by political statements. They may themselves be part of a little group or cult without even hardly knowing it. Any form of abusive relationship where there's an imbalance of power involves a destructive element, obviously. When it becomes amplified or used deliberately to exploit something, when the techniques that are involved in abusive relationships, and there are elements of dependency, codependency. Psychotherapists know a lot about this. They're dealing all the time in therapy, people coming out of trying to get out of abusive relationships. But when you're talking about groups, and this is what I'm mainly focusing on, the dynamics become a lot more complex and dangerous. Now, there are people who feel, well, there's danger scaremongering, that any group has a right to its ideas, and I think we would all agree with that. I certainly believe I have a right to my opinions, and I welcome somebody else's right to their opinion. That's not necessarily what goes on behind closed doors of destructive groups. And how do you find out about that, folks? By doing some field work, by becoming involved. And that can be quite dangerous. If I'm a person with an academic perspective, I have certain theories on social behavior, on human nature. And I try and look at that group from the outside. There's a lot I won't see as I look at through my theory. Yeah? I will downplay or ignore many elements of that functioning of that group that may be not visible until I go behind the scenes. So if you want to know that, then basically join me to some extent, and that is carries many risks. I have gone and done field work with groups. I have gone to various, what we would call destructive groups. Find out what's going on, what they expect from you, what they're going to offer. And sometimes that's very chilling, very destructive. We have to remember that many movements in the history of humanity are very destructive. Started off as a very small cult. The cult of Hitler, the cult of Stalin, the cult of Mao. And often they were laughed at by the people who looked on from the outside. But as they gathered momentum, and through the force of their personality, through various dynamics that were operating at the time, including fractures in society, economic depression in Germany, a lot of social upheaval for various reasons, they could play on those factors and exploit them. One word, little phrase that often comes to my mind, and I just happened to come across in the book very recently. It wasn't a book about cults, it was a book about psychology and about therapy work. And anyway, essentially, if I can remember the words almost, I think it's quite exact really. Hitler once said, "It's indeed fortunate for the leaders that the people do not think." In other words, they act as a herd. They're largely determined by what they see going on around them. They pick their cues from other people, from the environment, from the social environment, primarily. Now, that's so true. And as I say, many people say, I can't be influenced. They are being influenced already. Advertisers know that campaigns are having effects. I have worked with people in advertising and media over the years, and they know damn well how much influence you can exert on human beings. I know it's complex. What influences you may not influence me, vice versa, let's say. But I'm going to now hone in on what I have noticed and what I feel is reliable evidence from people who study cults, primarily from inside. Getting involved in a group can involve, often is at a time when the person is going through a transition. Maybe at an early stage in their lives, they're looking for meaning and purpose in life. They're coming out of those teenage rebellious years, trying to find a meaning, a role in life even. And they may be struggling with their own personal issues, family issues, low self-esteem. And based on their lack of development, even self-awareness problems because they're still vulnerable and maybe a bit naive about the world, a destructive group can hone in on those. They can exploit their vulnerabilities, and there are psychological tests that are used. There are actually, I remember years ago, it amused me at first when I saw the title, which said How to be a Guru, written by a German. He wasn't a psychologist, but he had been involved in cults and groups and somehow had emerged with quite an insight into the workings of some of these groups he'd been with. And in there he gave a whole long list of how you can become a cult leader. What to look for. How to appeal to different types of people. And it was a very good book. He was quite an actual psychologist. Not a theoretician only. He was very practical in his ideas. I never did manage to hold on to that book. Somewhere along the line I lost it. But I think if I ever could find it again, I'll certainly use it in my talks. You know, we need education, we need information about what happens when people are exposed, their nervous systems are exposed to certain kinds of influences. I've worked with the power of the mind for productive purposes in clinical settings. I've hypnotized people. They've had serious surgeries. Instead of general anesthetic, they've used their own mind to control pain. There's one of those up on the internet anyway, fairly recently, called hypnosurgery. The human mind's going to control not just pain, but heart rate, blood pressure, blood flow. The mind, power over the mind, over the body, over our behavior, and over behaviors of others. This makes us pretty unique as creatures. The animals largely work out of biological instincts. We follow those too, in various ways. But we have a whole other layer of ability, it seems. And that makes us more capable, but more vulnerable. Now, I've said that a person may be vulnerable. Their immune system at the psychological level may be low. You know, you've had a rough time. You've gone through difficulty. You break up in a marriage or in a relationship, or, you know, your girlfriend has left you and you're 19 years old and you're looking around for some direction. What can help me with my inner emptiness, with my lack of confidence? You may fall victim then to a group that's based around therapy, or if you have religious instincts, you know, spiritual beliefs. You may be drawn to somebody that has a higher message, who offers a quick fix instead of dealing with the great complexity of the human mind. The great difficulties of all the great religions and spiritual systems talk about of the spiritual path. They're offering a very simple set of techniques. You know, here's the 5 steps to enlightenment. Here is the methods that will get you there, the quick fix, the shortcut. And that may seem ridiculous to somebody studying those spiritual disciplines for many years, but at the time, again, when you're vulnerable, you might just say to yourself, I'll give it a try, and go along. And that may be the end of your life for 5 or 10 years, if you happen to be unaware of what's going on around you. Now, many people go into cults and leave them. Sometimes various people, academic research, say, oh look, they're free to come and go as they wish. It ain't that simple, folks. Many of those people who appear to have freedom and are out there, they live in a cult commune situation during the evening, or they go out to work during the day. They're held in thrall by these spellbinding gurus. They're held in their great control emotionally. And they have all the appearance of functioning, and they've been literally, in many cases, essentially, and I'll use the word programmed advisedly here, they've been programmed to behave almost as if they're normal, to speak and act in a convincing way that doesn't put other people off, but that helps them, helps the guru get what they want, helps the group maintain its existence and draw others in. A destructive group may use all kinds of methods to attract a person. People have been drawn in through phony camaraderie. Come on, join us. We're a charity. Or we're a self-help group. People may be drawn in through sex or personal development. That's popular nowadays. Groups will often metamorphose over the years to suit the times. You know, whatever is the buzz, if it's personal coaching, they may get you in on that and say, well, we're going to help you with your personal development. And that's a wonderful thing as far as I'm concerned. But what are the dynamics in the group? What is actually happening in terms of influence, power, balance of power? And where are the profits going? Where are the outcomes? And that's not easy to see at the beginning, because these groups practice various kinds of deception, various vaguenesses. They've got their spiel worked out very well, like a used car salesman. And the techniques of selling, which are well established in the world of sales, are applied and used. And they can use just about anything to hit your buttons once they get to know you a bit. We are all vulnerable. There is no studies that have shown only certain kinds of people are drawn to cults. People with high IQs, lower IQs, all kinds of abilities, you know, which wouldn't, and they may not fall for this type of group, but that type of group. There's a herd mentality in human nature. If one or two people join a certain group, their friends might feel, well, I'll go along and see what it's like as well. Some people join cults because essentially you're just as crooked as the leader. They're drawn to power. They're drawn to an opportunity to exploit. And that's deep in their nature. And much is the same way as the masochist and the sadist are attracted, they're complementary forces within the psyche. And much of that is subconscious. In subtle clues in the way they interact in a social setting, actually get to meet each other really well. If you've worked in therapy and worked with people who've been abused in relationships and see how they repeat that again and again, it's only when you work with them for a long time you find out how much of a subconscious, self-destructive program that the masochist has in there that causes them to keep falling foul of people who are very destructive to them. I keep making wrong choices in relationships, they say. And only when they understand that sufficiently, the dynamics of it, can they change. And they do change. Now, the exploiter doesn't usually turn up in therapy. They're on a different kind of art. They have a different kind of mythology. Anyway, so getting into the group name, Bob, here's the great answers to life's complexities. And even if you think, well, I don't think that could be really that simple, but I'll go give it a go. Just a one meeting may be enough if that group is well organized and happens to know a lot about persuasion and influence. So, the whole area of propaganda, advertising, all of that comes into this field. And that's something many people who research the field are not always aware of. That how much it is actually deliberately, consciously used in various groups. And I'm saying that because, having gone inside and seen how they work, I've been exposed to the leader. Having heard what they said privately to me about their followers, right? And how constantly they manipulate and use techniques of suggestion, hypnosis, and all the rest. They don't say to the person, sit down and share, I'm going to put you in hypnosis and imagine you're relaxing on a lovely beach and, blah, blah, blah. Or look at the swinging watch or look in my eyes. Hypnosis doesn't require any of that. That's just a ritual. The exciting imagination, the generation of expectancy, many dynamics of the subconscious mind are what we enact. And that's how people can be put into indirect and waking forms of hypnosis too. Levels of subconscious control and awareness. You ever see people running around the stage and stage hypnosis now? We cut out the stooges and the tomfoolery involved and all the rest. There is a genuine phenomenon going on there. That is, people can be persuaded, manipulated in various ways to act as if they're not God, to surrender some of their control, say. I'm not saying you get them to kill people. That's manipulation. And it takes quite a bit of other coercion, other factors to make that happen. But can you influence the nervous system of another human being through techniques such as persuasion, or through techniques such as hypnosis and suggestion? The evidence is overwhelmingly conclusive. Oh, yes. If you read the works of Hitler, he talked about having the mass rallies late at night when the subconscious mind is more available. The subconscious being the emotional mind, the non-logical mind, as opposed to the conscious critical factor. The great pomp and ceremony, the huge banners, those torchlight processions of the Nazis. Do you think that was all accidental? The whipping up of the emotion. Very little intellectual content. Of course, you have to appeal to people's vulnerabilities, their greed, their fear, their hatred of others. All the rest, you do have to do that. And to apply coercion. If you don't go along, finally, you may end up in prison or dead. But you don't need to do that to get most people on your side. If you do, get their emotions. This is what we're talking about, their emotional mind on track. Have you ever thought about that for yourself? How in your own mind, it's not an easy thing to control the subconscious normally. For example, consciously or logically, you can say to yourself, I should give up tobacco. It's bad for me. I'm sure it's killing me. My lungs must be suffering. I feel now the breath into me. And I read the statistics. Oh, they're so terrible. Heart disease, lung cancer. It's a motor game. You pay for the privilege of killing yourself. So intellectually you say, this is stupid, I won't do it. Okay? But your subconscious saying, oh, go on. Have a fag, you'll be okay. you love it, you need it, you can't live without it. You're so weak. You tried to do it before, you failed, you felt miserable. So go on, smoke, smoke, smoke. We constantly do things that are not in our best interest. So anybody who thinks that they're just in control of their mind because their logical mind says so is entirely foolish. Hitler also said we must appeal to the deeper mind, people's prejudices, people's fears, and non-logical elements of all kinds. Now, where did he get a lot of his ideas? Well, the father of modern mass marketing was Edward Bernays. He's acknowledged in the field of sales. Bernays was a nephew of Freud. And I won't go into this, it'll take me weeks to start talking about how he developed theories, but early on in his work, he applied a series of methods developed from Freud's ideas that we had in the darker side. They are the deep unconscious of Freud, originally referred to. And Bernays was very taken with this idea that if you could appeal to those levels of the mind, it would sweep aside logic. And people would do things, or buy things at least, that they really didn't need, but that they felt emotionally an attachment to. And that's still why to this day the salesman in his manual would say, you sell the sizzle, not the sausage. This is a rosy piece of inferior meat, mostly cereal or whatever. But it's the smell, it's the idea, it's all that excites your sensory, emotional elements of your limbic system and other parts of your brain. Anyway, his book, Propaganda, it was called. Propaganda didn't all have all the negative connotations it now has, but it became a very influential book, and the other writings of his have remained influential to this day. Goebbels carried it around with him as the Bible. That was Hitler's propaganda literature. So there's a long history to this. The focus groups that are used by politicians, the idea of using all kinds of spin, of appealing to people's patience and their emotional mind, is a big factor in how you influence people at all levels. Anybody who works with advertising knows about this. You sell the concept that has an emotional element, and you're not going to appeal the same to everyone. The younger people you're selling the car, you're going to emphasize it's exciting, it's sexy, it's to an older family man, this is a family, this is safe, this is a strong Volvo, this is what you need, or to the captain of industry, here's the top-range Mercedes. It's only a box with 4 wheels to get you made to be, but what does it symbolize? What does it emotionally say about you? And that's what people respond to. Napoleon said, men are led by toys. Things that have no value, other than what they emotionally kind of attach to them largely. Okay, so that's just about a look at that bigger picture. This talk is said about the mind uses of beauty. It can be used for good. If we can program our minds for beneficial purposes, and we can, I believe, there is a very healthy application of this. It can also be work against us, and we frequently use it against ourselves. Now, the cult leader knows how to use that against you, big time. He knows a lot more about your subconscious than you do. And he's gone into this in some depth. Some of them have stumbled upon it because, well, it's sort of in their nature. We'll come to that later. There's a sociopathic element in most cult leaders. And you need to know about that. Society needs to be able to identify that much more clearly than it does. And what I'm saying is based as well on this work with psychiatrists who have researched cult leaders who have spoken to them. I've worked with criminal types, murderers, very violent people, with some sociopathic tendencies, but often with great charisma, great power, great strength in their personality. And I won't go into that in great depth, but I will talk about what we can safely say about that overlaps with the dynamics of a destructive cult leader. Their hatred of others, their desire to exploit, see other people suffer. It seems strange to the rest of us, but those tendencies often exist in those people. And with a serial killer, mostly they like to torture their victims and see them suffer. They get enormous pleasure out of it. They get a high. And it becomes very addictive for them. That's anathema to most of us. We can't even begin to understand that because we identify with the person as a human being. Part of our brain says, I wouldn't like to experience that suffering. They don't see that. They get a thrill out. Even right through to a sexual thrill. All right, so that's talking now to take it right back to the cult. So when the person gets into the group, and in there's an element of, yes, I hope this is what it could be. This is the answer to my prayers. This person I project onto my father images. Here's the father figure, the mother figure, the loving father I never had at some subconscious level, fulfilling a psychological need of that barren inner child, a wounded, fearful, angry inner child. This is the person that will be my rescuer, that will help me. And all the others around the guru speak in that way about it. So, in they come into the group. But what's going to happen in there? Well, there's a group pressure to act and think in a certain way, and we all know if you get them to act a certain way, you get them to believe a certain way. Okay, the mind feeds back on itself. So there's a regimentation often, a very definite kind of strict set of beliefs. We talked about the freedom of groups to offer their services, their ideas to the state, and we would all support that to a point. But when you go behind the closed doors, that freedom rapidly disappears. It doesn't happen taken away instantly. Some groups take it away quicker than others, but it's channeled. You're losing your power to think more and more. You become into a closed sub-world. You're encouraged not to connect with other people often, or only in a way that's more limited. You're first of all usually programmed ahead to see them as wrong, bad, or flawed, or to limit your involvement, or even, well, they're nice people out there, the others, but they're on the wrong path. The group has the answers. The group is what you need to follow, and the leader, ultimately, is the kind of great God. The group will use all the techniques of emotional involvement. In other words, you can have that, the group is all encouraged to have that camaraderie, to support each other. It can be very phony. Years later, people walk out of the group and find that people they thought that were their friends hate them, or persecuting them, threatening them not to reveal about the group. And I've worked with the survivors of group abuse, and they talk to me about the harassment that they've had. Mike has mentioned a little bit about that. Anybody who stands in their way. The paranoid almost levels of hostility and hatred. Right? That gives the lie to their idea that we're just promoting we're another benevolent, not new religious movement. Of course, many groups are not. In this day and age, it's about destructive cause much about religion. They're about anything from the desire to get political influence, even believe it or not, in some cases. In others, just financial. And they can have a mixture of goals. And sometimes when you join a cult, the first message is personal development. Yeah, I'm going to help myself become more successful in my job, make more money. But then it becomes, as you get closer into the more involved, you find it's really, there's occult beliefs. There's a kind of whole spiritual philosophy you're asked to buy into. That the leader not only has this ability to help you sort out your life, but it's going to save your soul. They are the Messiah. They are the great prophet or whatever. Throughout history, we've been warned about false prophets. And I'll just come shortly to begin to talk about identifying those individuals. What are they after? Why are they that way? And telling what we kind of know so far. Now, in the group, there is an easy option sometimes. It seems you can avoid responsibility for your own thinking. The group will do it for you. So that's an attraction for some people. Particularly if they haven't been successful very much so far, they're lacking in confidence. Oh well, I'll hand it over to the cult. So cults will exploit, just like the confidence trickster will play on your greed, will play on your vulnerabilities. Alright, so they'll be able to do that too. They'll play on your shame, your guilt. They'll find those out. And there are psychological ways to do that. Any good counselor knows how to get people to open up. And in cults, they have handbooks on them. I have materials on the cults where here is the operator's handbook on how to interview people at different stages of involvement in the group. How do you get their commitment more and more? How do you get them so involved it finds it harder and harder to get out? where you then have to admit, I wasted 5 years of my life. I've got so little. And that's the nature of the destructive cult, isn't it? The inputs versus the outputs. You're giving a lot more than you're getting. And that's true of any relationship. You're giving more than you're getting. It is to that degree abusive. And the abuse can take many, many levels. Now, the group mindset is a powerful force to emotionalists because, as I said, we are all a herd-like as creatures. We don't like to admit it, but as anybody who works even in the clinical field will tell you, our belief that we are free, have free will in a kind of very definite sense of that word, is largely an illusion. Some famous psychologists once said, the illusion of free will is largely ignorance of the true motives of our choices. We just don't understand the side of that. Well, I believe human beings do have will, and free will in that general sense, which marks us out very strongly from animals, in the sense that I'm not saying they have no will, but human has a far greater choice, ability to use will. We can send a rocket to the moon, send a probe to Mars. We can develop nuclear weapons that threaten ourselves and terrify ourselves. So man's abilities far stretch much further. All right. Now in the group, undue influence is a concept that's been used as well to describe this, that there is a lack of allowing a person to think for themselves. And that's manipulated subtly by deception. It's also manipulated by lack of information. As I say, cutting off ties with external viewpoints, counter viewpoints. And that explains why some of the fanatical behavior you often hear. You don't need to talk. People say, I'm going to give a talk about undue influence or destructive groups. And immediately you have representatives of these people banging on your door. You're not talking about me, are you? I'm going to send spies here. I'm going to send representatives, make sure you don't mention our group. Well, what have you got to hide? Why can't you engage and be open? Well, as people become more and more involved in the group, they're finding it harder. It's not violent brainwashing, and I know the speaker is going to talk about that. There's no physical threats. Occasionally there are groups who use that once you're in it. Just like an abusive relationship, a person gets physically abused. I've known many groups where there's physical abuse goes on. But people feel just as ashamed afterwards to talk about it and won't talk about it. And have post-traumatic stress disorder type symptoms and take quite some time to get over it. Emotional abuse can be more damaging. We talk about thought reform. This is all there in the psychology and sociology literature. And though it's a big field still being researched, there's a lot we do know about. How people can befriend you, be your best friend, subtly erode your beliefs, replacing your you with theirs. Many forms of influencing, and I was talking about birthdays and propaganda. It took them 35 years to sell cigarettes to women, to get them to smoke. It took them over 45 years, with the great triumph of the brewing, was to get women to take up drinking beer. They weren't brewing beers, they weren't drinks that women drank. And people don't read the right literature. There are academic researchers who can't influence people that way, because my theory doesn't say so. I said, obviously you've never read any books on marketing. Expand your reading, at least, before you open your mouth. And get in there and see what's really happening. Emotional overload, chanting, various kinds of spiritual disciplines, chanting your mantra, using disorientation techniques, diets and fasting that lower physical and emotional resistance, sleep deprivation, exhausting techniques, narrowing of attention with stress arousal. All of that is used to heighten suggestibility. I'm not going to go into any of those in depth. There's a lot we could say about them. They can be done very subtly, and they can be done more overtly and more directly. The situational reinforcements in the environment where you're constantly exposed to this way of thinking can make you eventually accept beliefs that most of them will laugh at. Beliefs that we've come here for a spacecraft, and that we're being beamed in by messages that come to the cult leader from aliens. There are many flying saucer cults in America. They're very active. The people in them are not insane, but they have a very strong belief in this, and they go about their jobs normally. They come to be largely eccentric and largely harmless. In other cases, they certainly aren't. They exploit you financially, emotionally, in all kinds of ways. Within the group, what really worries, I think, a lot of us from a legal point of view, there's a lack of accountability, a lack of transparency, lack of appropriate sharing of responsibilities, lack of boundaries, betrayal of trust. Fear and various layers and types of fears can be used, just generating anxiety, hyping them up. We all hear about Waco and Jonestown. You know, Jonestown, that one that everybody's forgotten about, 900 members died with the paranoia of their group leader. These are the ones that hit the headlines. There's minor ones going on all the time, where 2 or 3 people are killed or they commit suicide as well as the cult. The links are often proven or ignored. Society likes to sweep under the carpet because it doesn't want to admit the extent to which human beings can be influenced often, or that we're so vulnerable. Even our leaders, in their own influencing others, not necessarily for valid reason, just to get their point across, there's a sort of subconscious resistance to pursuing some of this. The mass marketing industry doesn't necessarily want to tell you all about the techniques they use, do they? So there's various ways in which we are not given all the information we really need about this. I'm not saying it's not a conspiracy to destroy us or anything. It's just a reluctance to admit the problem and an unwillingness sometimes to admit that we ourselves or certain groups who are well established in society have to use techniques of persuasion. All the groups use it to some extent. We don't always want to admit it as much. The church in the past holds great sway over people. Sometimes it was reasonably beneficial for society, other times it was very destructive. But we are talking now about the groups where there's such a lack of accountability, where there's a totally different inner world than what is given out to the public, which the statements of the henchmen and the public representatives, the PR men of that group, bear no relationship to what goes on to the ordinary rank and file member, their experience within that group. If you're going to leave a group, or find it thinking about it, you're going to lose that group's support. You're going to have to rebuild your life. The pain of admitting you're wrong. You have to get motivation to leave. That's difficult. You've been conditioned. Your nervous system has been reinforced in this way. This is what you know. This has been your new family for years. And so it gets harder and harder to dissociate from it. If there's enough of the right kind of influence that can get to that person, well, then they can begin to question, to begin to form judgments again, and take a more balanced view of that group. Well, I'll talk a bit at the end about how to help people make their own decisions, again, for themselves, without the influence of the group, and without just my influence. But I want influence to be benevolent. That's how I see it. The group may say the same thing, but we'll let the person decide whether the truth is exposed or the facts are more available. Let the person really decide. Now, in giving this talk, I did say to Mike, I'll allow some time at the end for questions. I wanted to make it as practical, as down to earth, and as helpful to people who are here. Some of them have been involved with groups, and family members who've been involved in groups, and can't understand why that person has now taken up this set of beliefs, or is acting in this way, or won't talk to their family anymore. It can be immensely distressing to the family to see a person go in ways that they think are completely bizarre, to go off the rails, so to speak, and do bizarre things, think bizarre thoughts, and seem to be under the spell of these great gurus, these great leaders. Well, I will allow a little time in the talk just to deal with that, and I think later on in our discussion we'll be able to go into more depth. Well, this is just laying out the broad overview. Now, emotional overload, as I say, opens up the subconscious. When you get people behaving a certain way, where is the happy, clappy atmosphere? When all dissent is stifled. When you set it up like that, you've seen probably somewhere in the past in your mind, you may have seen the newsreel clips of Hitler's speeches. And how this big build-up, the warm-up acts, and how it's all building up that emotion, heightened level of subconscious activity. Whenever the emotions are up, the subconscious mind is more open. And this is used very deliberately and very systematically. Okay, you've got to know about these techniques if you want to become a cult leader. Now, I said I'd talk briefly about what are the kind of people who want to become a cult leader. What are these so-called teachers and gurus like? When I use the word guru here, I mean a phony guru. The word guru means teacher in the Hindu tradition, and obviously there's a benevolent use of that word. But these are the spellbinders, the destructive people who know how to charm you, who can be your best friend, your mother, your father, they can be everything and anything you want to be, because they have an amazing chameleon-like structure within them. Because largely there's a lack of a central person. They're sociopaths and psychopaths to quite a substantial degree. Now, I don't want to get into long descriptions, definitions of sociopaths and their behavior, but they are psychiatric terms, they're psychological terms, and there are criteria you have to meet to be called a sociopath. But there are sociopathic tendencies in lesser degrees in many people out there. They're a small percentage of the population at large, but they're there. You might have a boss who is slightly a sociopathic tendency, or more severe. Certain politicians may have their desire for power. We may not. But let me just say a few characteristics. The sociopathic individual, in their actions, has no conscience. They do not reform when they are found guilty of crime. Police know them as people who don't reform. They get worse if anything. They're consumed with a hatred. They have to keep other people down. I mentioned that a little bit earlier. They frequently have a very powerfully narcissistic personality disorder. They need the adulation of the group in much the same way as the group, the devotee at that time in their life may be feeling the need for a support, a loving friend, somebody who will be a help. They're usually very dominating and want to have that kind of top dog, alpha male type of dominance over the group. Dissent is not permitted. They can be extraordinarily charismatic, as I said earlier. But because they have no inhibitions and have a disordered personality, they don't see risks. They're not laboring under the normal, shall we call it, inhibitions that most of us have, which are healthy. We will question our behavior. We'll think, well, if I do that, that will happen. They don't think like that. The sociopathic bank robber always thinks he's going to succeed. The idea of getting caught is such a minor part. And I've worked with bank robber clients, not theory. Criminals, violent men. There's lower frontal lobe activity in many of these people. They lie totally convincingly. It's almost entirely believed. In some cases, gurus and cult leaders do partially believe what they say. Not always, by the way. Now, it is almost impossible for the person under the control, or at least the influence of one of these spellbinders, to accept what's going on within that disordered personality called leader. Many of the cult devotees, they'll die for a group leader. They'll surrender and do anything virtually for them. Because, and when you're trying to talk to them at that time, when they're in the throes of their involvement, you have literally no chance. I was talking to a doctor in America recently, an MD, who's fallen under the influence of one of these personal development gurus, who happens to have a very destructive personality. He's been exposed on television as being destructive before. And I happened to mention to the doctor, this man spent some time in the penitentiary for counterfeiting money in the USA. And he said, he was on cocaine at the time, he was young. As if that justifies it. Now he's got two crimes as far as I'm concerned. He's abusing cocaine, possibly dealing it as well, as many people do, selling it to friends, whatever. He was just going through a bad time. Well, we all go through our teenage rebellion. We all go through our teenage ups and downs. That doesn't involve systematic counterfeiting and other things this chap is involved in. So there we're talking about the issue of denial. Usually you can't get through to those people easily until you spend enough time with them. working systematically with them to get them to consider things in more depth. They don't want to consider the possible motives of the cult leader. It is so painful to admit that that person you're projecting on really doesn't give a toss about you, to use the vernacular. We quite happily see you dead, and in some cases prefer to see you dead or destroyed once they've got everything out of you. That doesn't come into most people's thinking. I have heard people say that, and that's what they want to do, to kill others and hear them, feel them suffer, see them suffer. Well, not really feel them, they just get it. They could suffer, so give them some more pain. When they're in the throes of that involvement, they are under the influence of those forces of conformity, obedience that Stanley Milgram and other people, eminent psychologists, sociologists, other people have researched this. The early experiments on conformity and the obedience experiments of Milgram were set up at the time to try to understand by the government in America originally. That was one of the early stages of that work. How could a whole population fall under the influence of Hitler? He wasn't educated, he wasn't attractive looking, he didn't seem to have much to say. If you listen to his speeches, if you understand German, he says very little most of the time. But it's such power, and such emotion. And he hit certain emotional buttons in the group, of course, but how could he exert that influence? And when you interview people who were in the army, and they say, when the Führer walked along, and he looked at the audience, I knew he looked at me, he looked into my soul. You know what, maybe 100 people will say that, and you can't even look into all of their eyes. What projection, what influence was he exerting there? And that's part of a bigger picture we won't go into here, but it's part of the power of suggestion, part of the sociopathic individual's ability to use persuasion and suggestion so fully because they don't hold any inhibitions or conscience about what they say or do. I'd say many criminals appear very brave, but it's because they're not thinking of the consequences. And people are attracted to that. Have we ever come across the phenomenon of people who worship gangsters? Our gangster movie culture is a part of that. You know, we like to think of the gangsters as, well, in some ways, for all of his crimes, at least he's not just a victim of society. You know, he goes out and does his own thing. He's kind of heroic. He's got guts. No, they're sad and pathological, and they have many other destructive qualities we don't even need to go into here. But the projection of people often is, I think of them as attractive, somehow exciting and interesting. And people often become under the thrall of characters like that. There's a worship of the Cray twins in East London still to this day. Pedophilic, murderers, you name it, people looking up to them. Well, the streets were safer when they were around, at least. Yeah, they were killing everybody. Well, people write to them, women want to marry these men. It's quite primal, you know. That power that they seem to exude based on no qualms of conscience, no elements of questioning their own behavior. After being in that cult for a while, it's very hard to leave, as I say, to feel that you were wrong, you weren't loved after all. And that really opens up a whole can of worms. Can I really accept that I'm so worthless? These are people who haven't yet learned to love themselves and mark their own scorecard. You now have to accept that you were just a tool, a pawn in a big game plan of the guru, who will move on to the next person to exploit them, and the next one. No matter, the more the merrier. And their grand plans for improving the world, you know, you're joining an elite group, and that plays to your ego. This group is going to go out there and save humanity. Has the tools, the knowledge to make a better world. When you begin to see through it all and realize, no, it's not happening for me, it's not going to happen for others. You've lost your money, maybe your health, mentally, emotionally, your relationships have been severed with other people outside the group. You've been exploited, that human desire for revelation, to reveal to others, for intimacy, that's been exploited. You've come to the end of your psychic massacre. Even you are saying, this is more pain than even I want. And now you're ready to think about leaving, if that ever happens in some cases. Well, what can we do to help people? Better if we didn't have them get into the spell of these sociopathic cult leaders in the first place. But I've done a lot of work with people to help them make their decisions. First step I've always talked about is empathic counseling. That means getting on the side of their fence, finding out what they think, what they believe. I'm not going to preach them and say, listen, you're being calm. This criminal has formed as long as your arm. You've just been too lazy to investigate. He's been convicted in the courts. By the way, when in his youth he was a paedophile, or he's done time in the penitentiary for counterfeiting. Or he was a butcher or a plumber who decided that, there's more money in running a personal development college. He did a short course on counseling or life coaching. And he's now going to get you involved in this coaching scandal. You're going to buy into his franchise. All of that. You haven't done that, but now at least you're willing to look. So what will I say to them? One young man fairly recently was asked by his parents to talk to him, and he sort of respected some of the work I had done because he was interested in the power of the mind. He was at that experimental, adventuresome phase of life, looking into the possibilities of the mind. So he came along to me and I said to him, well, listen, tell me about what it is that you are dealing with, learning here in this group. And he talked about the methods they were using. I hope we're not all too cold here. This feels pretty cold. We get up and move around shortly after we've had this 2 quick questions. What are you learning? And you say, well, this is the kind of meditation we do. This is the kind of thinking and mantra we're supposed to do. And I said, that sounds a lot like the Buddhist concept of mindfulness. Stilling the mind. Now, again, it can be used to subdue the critical analysis. So these are more open to suggestion. To bypass conscious thinking to get into subconscious. But anyway, I said to him, well, okay, that sounds like that Buddhist concept of mind. Did you know that that there's another version you can do this way? And I explained that system has come into other kinds of philosophies in the current time, in our time. Now what am I doing? I'm expanding his view fairly quickly that this is not unique to this cult leader. This great guy did not descend from heaven with his message. He's read a book or two. Maybe you could read a few more paperbacks and find out just as much as he knows, or even more so. So I'm telling you, the message of the Guru is not unique. There are plenty of people who've had similar ideas. And there's a lot more to it than he's telling you. This whole path involves many other things. And I'll ask him, what have you heard and how is it working so far for you? What stage have you got to now? And soon he's beginning to think, well, I'm only on this level of it, and maybe others around me. I'll ask him, how are the advanced people in the group doing? What stage have they got to? And I'll talk to him about other stages, other ways of using it. So very rapidly, I'm putting what he has learned in a bigger context. So he can begin to question, shed doubts on what he's learning, critically analyze it, evaluate it. And that's very important for him, that he forms his own judgment about it. I'm really cutting the ground from underneath a lot of the false beliefs. I'm not doing it deceitfully. I'm simply reflecting back to him, well, I genuinely believe the truth, that he's been fed a very partial message. A few techniques and ideas which are probably quite okay and have been around forever, but he doesn't understand that. He thinks the Guru is the fount of all wisdom and knowledge. Alright, so bit by bit, his position will be moved. So after a while, the Guru is not seen as, to say, the fount of all knowledge. He's more fallible, more vulnerable. Finally, even he has feet of clay. When he begins to look further into the work of the Guru and his influence on those around him and how much have they benefit. And where are the results? That's the thing that they ultimately will have to focus on. We're told in Christianity the tree is known by its fruits. What is the evidence? What are the outcomes? What are the results of all of this stuff that this group have achieved? Where are the geniuses they produced in 30 years? Where are the millionaires they produced? Where are the enlightened people? Where is... You start telling me quick. And very soon, they're starting to run into a problem. But you start gently, you build up to it. I'm going to give you information about therapy, how we can work to help people begin to understand what's happened to them, help them understand their own dynamics, take control of their own subconscious mind, instead of having somebody else do it to you. Information, education at that point will be necessary. It would have been a lot easier if they'd never got involved in the first place. Many of these groups have very deep pockets. They challenge people like mine. They threaten people. They have their lawyers. They have their crooked lawyers. What we need to do as a society, just begin to sum up on this, is to become much more aware, more open about it, and get out of the culture of denial. People have a right to do anything they want, yes, provided it's not destructive society. Many of those people who said there's nothing harmful about cults, they're just alternative groups, alternative ways of thinking about the world. Some of them had to recant their beliefs and ideas to some extent, at least, after the 7/7 bombings, when they saw perfectly intelligent people join up, doctors who let off bombs. It's nothing to do with your brain's intelligence. Some of the best people, with the most talent, can be suckered into cults and groups. All of us. It's not just a mob mentality, the lynch mob. It is a subtle form of manipulation, distortion over time. These groups resort to pyramid selling. Undue influence is used. That already exists in law. It needs to be tightened up. They have false advertising. They have many techniques, or many, I should say, things that they do that do go against existing consumer laws, but we're very loose about following them up. We're too scared of the challenge of, oh, you're interfering with religious freedoms. You know, you're interfering with our right to existence. Well, no. I'm not going to do so anyway. So, there's a degree of corruption. They bought academics and other people who come out with quasi-scientific and various kind of information saying, oh, well, it can't be that harmful, blah, 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 blah. Well, if you work in the clinical setting, you'll see quite a different picture emerging than when you sit and talk to the cult leader and his PR man. We need justice here. We need people to take a more realistic and open attitude to this and move forward. There are various factors in force that lead to denial in people and in society even. We can't go into all of that here. The culture of denial and saying it's all not my business was what led to people like Hitler becoming strong. When the immune system, psychologically speaking, in a society is weak or weakened, sluggish anyway, it becomes very prone and very vulnerable to destructive individuals and groups. And they're out there preying on you if you just happen to be unlucky enough. The predator is waiting for any of us at the moment of our backs are turned when we're weak. And that's the time that's going to be true for all of us. Every human being is composed of strengths and weaknesses. And we need to have more research and more clarity about many of these issues I've just been talking about in this very broad and general way. And I would like just in the last sentence to say, the power of the mind exists. There's no question about that. Atheist, religious person, we're accepting more and more what the power of the human mind can do. It's been there throughout history in religion and various mystical, spiritual philosophies. It's been there in non-religious philosophy as well. But at a time when Melbourne neuroscientists studying the brain and how the nervous system can be influenced and used creatively, and said the work we've done in the clinical setting, in medical settings, that is primarily here now, for controlling pain, heart rate, all of the powers of the human being that are in us exist to be used. They can be used for good or for bad. It's up to us to protect and use it creatively and help others to become aware of their power and use it creatively rather than have it stolen and abused by destructive people. Okay, I'll turn you loose at that point and end my talk. And I've got a little longer than about 5 minutes longer than I anticipated, but anybody have any questions?